Well, Dave, big news this weekend. Judge on the United States Supreme Court passed away. Everyone's heard about it by now. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, better known as RBG.
And if you haven't heard about it yet, will you tell me where your hole is so I can come join you? Because I'd be really happy, even if it's just for a weekend. Just get me away for 1 weekend.
It's kind of funny. For the people who have not heard about it yet, wherever they are, it's either a really pleasant place or a really scary place. One of the two. I'm not sure which.
Is there anything scarier than Seattle or Portland or New York City
Well,
right
that's
now?
true.
I mean, that was the other big news that the DOJ has designated them as anarchist cities.
Anarchist.
I don't know what that means.
Right.
I have no idea what that does for government control and federal government.
In fact, there's a kind of a contradiction. To be an anarchist city, right? To be a city means there has to be some kind of law, some kind of boundaries, and to say that so they really could have just dropped the city part and said this is just anarchy. Right. Period.
So anyway, back to the news of the week.
RBG. I was out in Connecticut giving some talks and was at a dinner with some friends and colleagues, and everyone's phone started, getting notifications that she had died. And there's a lot to reflect on. There's a lot to be said. Certainly, this was a woman who led a pretty remarkable life. I think her life story is both a testimony to her grit and determination. I mean, she sure did have a lot of not just small obstacles, but big obstacles.
Sure.
I mean, a dying husband she was tending to as she was trying to get through law school and things like this. I mean, the woman certainly knew her share of challenges in life. So her life story is a testimony to her, but also a testimony to the United States. I mean,
sure.
Think of, this very small, petite Jewish woman, right, becomes a justice on the United States Supreme Court from Bill Clinton appointed her, I believe it was 1993, I think, if I remember right. From 1993 to 2020, it's 27 years, over a quarter of a century sitting on the high court. And, you think of the history of the Jews, where else would that have been possible throughout history? And the answer is not many places, not many periods of time.
I don't talk about it a whole lot in our content, in our podcast, but I was sitting at dinner with my parents preparing for Rosh Hashanah as a Jew when the news came across. It was about 5:30-ish that I got the first text. Our services, our Zoom services this year, which was it's another
weird,
conversation
right?
for another time. But we are sitting at home and we're just sitting down to dinner and my phone just starts going crazy.
Right.
Mom turns to me, "What's going on?" "Well, here's the news." And it was the topic of conversation, right? It is very special for, I don't care what your political persuasion is or anything else. There has never been a country in the history of the world where somebody could have a lifetime appointment in government. A high lifetime. That is one of the rarest and most often sought jobs in the country.
Yeah.
Within government, at least. And it was a small, petite, sometimes frail Jewish woman. Mm-hmm. That never would have happened anywhere, anytime before that.
And there are so many things to talk about her. I mean, there's her life story, which we're sort of hinting at, was rather incredible, and it was. There's her performance as a judge. There's her actual the opinions that she wrote, her concurring opinions, her dissenting opinions, many of which were, from my point of view, less than desirable. I wish she had done more to uphold the constitutional constraints on government and did less to advance the spread of the progressive administrative state. But we citizens really don't have any time to breathe and reflect and talk about her and everything that her life meant, because instantly, the moment that news hit, immediately the attention of millions of people, certainly the pundits, the journalists, the political class, and also millions of citizens paying attention, instantly went to politics.
Right.
Because she was one of 9 judges on the Supreme Court. It means her seat is now vacant. No one's there. And there is near panic out there about who, right? And this wringing of hands and this desperation and this angst and anxiety about who is going to be the replacement. And the reason is what we have been talking about in some recent podcasts here, the politicization of everything. I think maybe that should be the title of a book we write, right? The politics of everything, or politicization of everything.
Right.
As government has gotten involved in, well, basically everything, that means everything becomes political. You throw out a subject, a topic at a family dinner, it doesn't matter what the topic, any topic in the world, any topic imaginable, government is either regulating it or subsidizing it or has turned it into an entitlement program,
right,
or is involved one way or another. And therefore, we can't escape politics. And it's what makes that seat then on the court so immensely important, because who knows how a future court might rule on some law, on some regulation, on some future or on some past precedent from set down by the court itself.
Well, think about what it really means. The court has the ability to decide, can a government program exist or not? Can a law exist or not? Can a regulation exist or not, right? Anything that somebody wants to challenge as this is not the role of government, or this is the role of government, can push that all the way to the Supreme Court. And ultimately, the Supreme Court is going to decide, should the government take care of our health care? Should the government take care of our finances? Should the government take care of our senior security or our Social Security program? Should the government be involved in this? And ultimately, we've gotten to a point where the Supreme Court makes that decision.
Right. Well, so what it means, right, the stakes are so elevated if you were to ask the question, if I was to ask you, well, Dave, what's really at stake in that seat? What does it matter who sits there? I think an honest answer would be everything.
Everything.
Everything's at stake because government's involved in everything. So whatever program, whatever government subsidies you're getting, whatever contracts you have, whatever regulatory preferences your business gets that puts the screws to your competitors, whatever your interest is in the big progressive administrative state that we have today, man, that seat could have a big impact on your life.
And it could have an impact on things that are that big, and as big as all the things you're talking about, or minute things. Should the government be able to regulate the type of shingles you use on your roof? Or should the government be able to regulate, or should we be allowed to have multiple national anthems? I mean, all of these things that are part of this daily conversation,
That's right.
Eventually somebody's going to sue, because that's what America's turned into, right?
Yeah.
Government has some control. We are going to sue over something.
Yeah.
And somebody's going to sue, and somebody's going to countersue, and we're going to keep fighting this, and they're going to keep going until eventually it gets in front of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has to decide what role in your life should this little tiny thing or this really huge thing,
right,
what role should the government have?
You know, I suspect the politics of everything becoming political because government's involved in everything. I think many Americans are tiring of it. I mean, it's kind of exhausting. I'm a political guy. I study politics and write about it. I find it exhausting, right? The fact that you can't escape it, it's everywhere. And I suspect many progressive Americans, I think they tire of it too. I mean, it is exhausting. And what it really boils down to is progressivism, progressive citizens, they want government regulation, government subsidies, government control over everything, but they don't want everything to become political. And therein is the rub, the contradiction. You can't have both of those same two things at the same time.
Well, two things have to happen. One, you have to get rid of the Constitution.
Yeah.
If you want all of those things to happen and it not to be political, you have to get rid of the Constitution, and you have to have 100% agreement that, yes, the government should do this.
Right.
And if 100% of Americans all agreed that government should be in every aspect of our lives, it should be taking care of every aspect of our lives, and there was no Constitution to say, no, that's wrong,
Right.
then I suppose you can. But if we can get 340 million people to agree on everything.
Well, it's interesting. It reminds me, this is kind of the wonky academic side of me. When Aristotle is famous for the observation that man, and when he said man, he meant human beings, members of the species
Mankind.
Homo sapiens, right? Mankind.
Yes.
That man is not merely a social animal, he's a political animal. And the difference is there are many social creatures, bees, ants, wolves, fish. I mean, there's all kinds of animals that live in swarms or herds or groups of some kind. They're social. But he made that distinction of man is social too. He needs to live around other human beings. But people are also political in the sense that they're the only beings who will raise a question. They'll challenge what is right or what is just or what is the proper role of government. And so the point is, you were sort of making this fantastic imaginary world where everyone agreed and so we wouldn't have politics. But the point is, wherever you have human beings, you're going to have politics of some kind because you're going to have people disagreeing on what's right, what's proper, what's just.
Well, when you talk about the animal kingdom like that, I started thinking of bees. Mm-hmm. And bees are that. A bee colony is exactly what you're talking about. There is the queen bee.
Yep.
There's no discussion.
Nope.
These bees aren't buzzing back and forth saying,
no dissent, no debate.
I should be the queen, not
Right.
you. We shouldn't have a queen. We should have a king. We should.
Worker bees never form unions and demand better working conditions, right? Ever.
Right. And then I started thinking about that Jerry Seinfeld movie, the Bee Movie. I think it was called Bee Movie or something like that. It was an animated cartoon.
I don't think I know about this movie.
And Jerry Seinfeld plays this young teenage bee who doesn't want to be a part of the hive and wants to go out and explore the world.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, the bee colony becomes political.
Right.
And when you apply human traits, the point of it is when you apply human traits to animals, they become every time anybody's ever written about this, they become political animals.
Let's be really specific. Not any human traits, but reason, speech. Right. Articulating ideas of justice and rightness versus wrongness. That's when it becomes political. Yeah, absolutely. It's also interesting, when you look at this opening on the Supreme Court and the passing of Justice Ginsburg, I think it is causing some people to reveal some of their real, I was going to say their true colors, but maybe that's offensive to some people to say true colors. I don't know, but their real agenda, what they're all about. Joe Biden, you and I were talking about this before we started recording. He's been out there speaking in the last few days. He's deeply worried, deeply concerned over who's going to fill that seat, who's going to be the president to nominate that justice. And what he's worried about right now is it's not even Roe versus Wade, which is what a lot of people are talking about. He's worried about Obamacare.
Right.
Because the fear in Biden is he knows the thing that was passed is patently unconstitutional.
Right.
There's no constitutional authority or power given to Congress to pass a law basically taking over the entire health insurance industry. And Joe Biden is scared that if a constitutionalist actually ends up on the court, by golly, they might strike that thing down.
Right.
And it's one of the huge risks of creating a progressive administrative state so long as there's any semblance of the Constitution that remains.
That's what I think we bring this back around to, right? We were talking all last week about how it's progressivism that has brought politics into virtually everything. Forget the word virtually. Progressivism has brought politics into everything in our lives. Why? Because progressives create laws that they know violate the Constitution. They create programs, they create regulations, and they have said for 150 years that the Constitution needs to be a living document. It needs to evolve in order to fit the needs of the society at that time. And Joe Biden doesn't want a Supreme Court justice who interprets the Constitution and applies it as law to these progressive programs that are getting into everybody's lives. He wants somebody who is going to say, no, the Constitution doesn't matter. The Constitution's a living document, and giving free health care. And I really hesitate to use that word, but I'm quoting them.
Well, for those of us who are listening to us, Dave's putting up air quotes right now, right? When he says the word free.
Right. So this so-called free health care.
Right.
He knows it's unconstitutional. He just needs more Supreme Court justices. And the truth is, a lot of our progressive friends want the same. They're not sitting on Facebook and Twitter and social media and emails and phone calls and lunches saying Obamacare is constitutional and it is supposed to be there and the Constitution calls for free health care for everybody. No, they're saying we think we need Obamacare. We think that's the only way to get health care for everybody.
We want it. We will it to be.
Right. By any means necessary, as certain city council members in our town like to say. Because of that desire for something, they're not looking for a constitutionalist on the court. They're not looking for the court to do its job. They're looking for somebody who will say, sure, don't worry about the Constitution. I'll protect all of these extra programs.
I want to make your point even stronger. I agree with what you said, but I think it can be made even stronger. Progressives today, and I want our listeners to let this really sink in. To be a progressive in the United States of America in 2020 is to be a person who is terrified, horrified at the prospect of a constitutionalist sitting on the Supreme Court of the United States. Think of what that means. To look at that court, to know that their whole purpose is to judge in cases, in conflicts. And every now and then a conflict involves a constitutional question. The thing that strikes terror in the souls of a progressive is the idea of some Supreme Court judge who actually has fidelity for the United States Constitution. They're actually they might actually uphold the very document that they swear an oath to uphold.
Right.
To be a progressive today means we want justices who either just ignore it, that's preferable, just ignore the Constitution, or if they have to actually look at it and write about it in their opinions, then lie about what it means, make up some meaning that's not supported by the words of the document itself. You threw out an interesting length of time just a moment ago. You were talking about progressivism over the last 150 years. That takes us back to 1870.
Right.
And I think that's dead on right. I would call that the progressive era. In fact, I've started in some writings capitalizing the P and the E, the progressive era as a distinct formal period of time. And that's perfect. 1870 to 2020, that's 150 years that we have been dealing with progressivism. That progressivism has been growing, spreading, wrapping its tentacles around everything, as we've been talking. It means citizens of the United States have lived under progressivism and progressive government longer than they have lived under genuinely constitutional government.
Yeah.
Right? You think of from 1776, the Declaration of Independence, or if you want to date, the beginning to 1787, either one, you get up to about 1870. It's roughly 100 years. And progressivism begins it comes out of the ashes of the Civil War. And so we have lived more under progressivism than under the original Constitution. It's also interesting when you go back to that period, of course, that's just a few years after the Civil War, just a few years after Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. And Lincoln's kind of an interesting model in how to think about the Supreme Court in particular, how to think about the Constitution in general. He had some big conflicts with the court. Remember the Chief Justice who actually swore him in when he was inaugurated in March of 1861 was none other than Chief Justice Roger Taney, who was the guy who wrote the opinion in the disastrous, horrible Dred Scott case a few years earlier, which in many ways helped lead to the Civil War. And Lincoln said, he was very clear about this. He said, the Supreme Court hands down these opinions, and when a Supreme Court opinion fully settles a question, meaning there's no challenge, there's no problem. We call those precedents. We call those authorities. The lawyers sometimes throw out the fancy Latin stare decisis. Let the decision stand. And it's an indication to future courts, to lawmakers, to citizens, the court's position on this question, whatever it is. But Lincoln challenged the Dred Scott case because he said that is not a precedent. It was a badly divided court. In fact, that court was so divided, there was a question for days after the court handed down its published opinions, what a majority of the justices actually agreed upon, because they all wrote separate opinions. So you have 9 opinions, and some are concurring with others in parts and dissenting from others. And you looked at all this stuff saying, do 5 of them actually agree on anything? Is there a majority here? It wasn't clear at first. And he said it was so divided, and it was based on this is Lincoln's phrase. It was based on assumed historical facts, which really aren't true. That's a diplomatic way of saying lies.
Sure.
It was based on lies, falsehoods. And so he said, of course, it is right. It's respectful. It's our duty as citizens to challenge when the court has gotten something wrong and do what we can to get the court to reverse itself, to correct that erroneous opinion, which might include winning elections as president, nominating new justices in the future. And I think when I think of the court today, I think that's a good model. The court has made some disastrous opinions in modern history, and it's not only respectful, it's dutiful on our part to encourage the election of presidents and other politicians, members of the Senate who have to confirm, who will actually put constitutionalists on the Supreme Court to correct some of these misguided precedents and prior cases. There's another piece of this too.
Before you move on from that, let's also remind people, and this isn't necessarily agreement or contradiction with what you just said, but it's something that people often forget. Just because a Supreme Court justice gets put on the court, and just because the court might disagree with a previous ruling, they don't just get to change a ruling out of nowhere. There has to be another case brought forward, and they have to rule on that case and show why the previous precedent was wrong and the new precedent should be set.
Right.
And I think people forget. They think immediately, because of this sense from progressivism of this legislation from the bench.
Right.
I think a lot of people think, okay, so we've got our legislators in Congress, right? You've got the House of Representatives, you've got the Senate, and they're legislators. And now they want the president to legislate via executive order. And they wanted Clinton to do it, and they wanted Obama to do it, and they wanted Bush to do it, and they want Trump to do it. This is not new, right? The executive order legislating from the Oval Office. And they want their judges to legislate from the bench. They can't do that. They can't just call up the president one day and say, "Hey, you know that decision, that Dred Scott decision, really didn't like that thing. I think we're going to take another look at it."
Right.
So I think people need to be reminded of that.
You are right about that. We have a passive court system, meaning this is the premise of our entire judiciary. Those judges, those courts, they sit there and do nothing.
Right.
Nothing until a legal controversy is brought before them. A case has to be presented to them, and then they will hear arguments, right, and read and learn about the case and render some kind of opinion about the case. That's actually what they call what the court produces are opinions. It's the opinion of the court. in a particular case.
The majority opinion and the dissenting opinion.
That's right.
And people also need to remember, generally, not always, but the huge majority of the time, those cases have gone through lower courts.
Yes.
First.
Very often.
It's not like, hey, we have this issue. I'm going to file a lawsuit today, or the DA is going to file a lawsuit and take it straight to the Supreme Court so we can just have it. It's a long process to even get there. And then the Supreme Court has to decide, do we even want to take this under consideration?
The Constitution acknowledges and defines the difference between the court's original jurisdiction. These are cases that can be heard for the very first time in the Supreme Court, and that is a very tiny, narrow range of cases. It's basically cases involving, say, states suing each other over water rights. Maybe they share a river boundary or something like that. They knew there'd be cases where states are suing states, and those kinds of cases, you don't want to hear the case in one of the states, right? Who's part of the lawsuit. But most of the cases the court hears, you're right, the vast majority are appeals. They are cases that have been heard at some lower court and have worked their way. The losers have been appealing and appealing and appealing. And it works its way up to the Supreme Court, and that takes time. That doesn't just happen the day that a new justice is confirmed for the Supreme Court.
Right.
We were talking about Lincoln,
right?
And there's one more point about Lincoln I want to make that I think our members of the Vino Veritas Society might appreciate. It just adds some depth to how to think about not just a Supreme Court justice, but also members of the government in general. When Lincoln was president, now he personally had articulated a personal opinion. I'm going to make it stronger, a hatred towards slavery. Mm-hmm. He despised the practice, the institution. He thought it was a heinous wrong, a fundamental moral wrong, and it needed to be abolished. He said in many different times and in many different ways, his desire was for all human beings to live freely.
You used a line last night in one of your presentations about if slavery is not wrong, nothing is.
Yes. Yeah, he absolutely said that. He said he thought slavery was not just a wrong. He thought it was a fundamental wrong. And he said if slavery is not wrong, then nothing's wrong. Meaning if that's not a violation of the moral law, the natural law, for one human being to own another human being, then what possibly could be wrong, right? I mean, and so that's his personal view, that's his personal opinion. He thought it through, and he had a deep principled reason for that moral opinion about slavery. And then he gets elected as president. And many of his political allies, many fellow Republicans who were his friends, including some high-profile political people like Horace Greeley, who's the publisher of one of the most influential newspapers in the country at the time, the New York Tribune, they are pushing on Lincoln hard. You're now president. Get rid of slavery. You say you hate it. Go get rid of it. And Lincoln was always aware that with a constitution sets definite limits on the powers of those in government. The Constitution grants certain powers to members of Congress. It says you may legislate over these certain things, and that's it. It limits and defines the powers of the president. The president is there to execute the laws that have been passed by Congress, right? Not to do whatever the president personally wants to do. And same with members of the judicial branch of government. And so there's this separation. If you have a constitution and you respect it, people who are in government respect the Constitution. The citizens who vote for people in government respect the Constitution. Then it separates a politician's personal opinions, personal views versus their constitutional, their exercises of constitutional power. They realize that as president or as a justice on the Supreme Court or even as a member of Congress, there are certain things they may do constitutionally, and there are many things they might want to do, but they cannot do constitutionally. In the era of progressivism, where we have basically removed the Constitution from our public life, from our political life. We've removed it from government. It's not a controlling, binding presence in government. That distinction becomes much more blurred. Now, all of a sudden, it matters much more who is the president, who is sitting on the Supreme Court, because we don't really have constitutional constraints on their power. So the real question is, what do they want to do personally?
And the Supreme Court is the sort of the last line of defense in this. And as we've talked about through the various toolboxes, especially the American Idea toolbox, for those members who have gone through that, there's a reason that the Supreme Court is the furthest removed from the will of the people, because they are the last line of defense to make sure if this is not constitutional, you can't do it.
Right.
But the more presidents get to put non-constitutionalist progressive justices on that Supreme Court, that last wall gets...
Yeah, I mean, and in fact, when you go through the Federalist Papers, just as this is true. What I'm going to say is true for the political theory of the founding as a whole. You see expressions of these concerns in various ways, but it is especially true in the Federalist. If you read it as a book from start to finish, in the first part of the Federalist Papers, there is this admiration and overt praise. In fact, it's kind of gushing. It's flattery towards the American people. You, the people, you're so wise, you're so virtuous. It's over the top, right? And it's exaggerated. Hamilton and Madison, they don't really
remember.
They don't really think the American people are as wise and as virtuous as they say.
Well, they say it after 4 or 5 times previously saying how much they don't trust the average American. So there is clearly there's
a qualification.
Yes.
And it's fascinating as you go through the book and this government that has been designed, this Constitution. Certainly the people are the ultimate source of authority, and the people should authorize what this government does and be involved. But Hamilton and Madison start to introduce parts of this government that are increasingly separated from the immediate passions of the people. And the very last part of the national government that gets introduced in the Federalist Papers is the least democratic part, the Supreme Court.
Right.
Because members of it are not directly elected at all. A president nominates, and then the Senate decides whether to confirm or not confirm the judges who sit on the Supreme Court. And what that means, when you really think about this self-governing republic that has some democratic elements, people vote and things like that, the court then serves as a kind of brake. I always think of the court as a brake on popular passions, on the mobs out there who might be demanding bad legislation, unjust legislation, and maybe some weak-kneed members of Congress caved in and passed some bad legislation that violates property rights, violates the individual liberty of others. And the court is removed from that to a large degree, and they can say, no, that's unconstitutional. It might be popular, but it's unconstitutional, and we're declaring it so.
And let's also remember how much further removed it used to be from the will of the people, right?
Yes.
There's a reason that it's the Senate and not the House of Representatives that was chosen to advise and consent.
Good point.
Right? The Senate before the 17th Amendment was not directly elected, was not popularly elected, and was elected by the state house.
So you have senators who are fairly far removed from the masses of people out in the street. From the mob. And they're the ones deciding whether to confirm or not a judge who's going to sit on the Supreme Court for a lifetime, for all intents and purposes. It's highly rare for no member of the Supreme Court has ever been removed. Only one has been impeached, and that was very early on. So basically, if you get confirmed to the Supreme Court, you're there as long as you want to be. There's another interesting aspect about the Supreme Court. I'm sure some folks have written about this, but I can't point to any titles off the top of my head. During the first roughly 100 to 150 years of our republic, many Supreme Court justices served short terms on the court. They would be there for 5 years, 8 years, maybe 10 years. They would retire from the court and go back and practice law, run their business. These were productive people. And they thought they didn't want to spend their time sitting there on the Supreme Court because back then government was not involved in everything. They weren't part of the Central Planning
They were
Commission.
probably pretty bored.
Yeah.
They wanted to go. They had this new designation on their resume on their CV that they could go back and say, hey, you want a good lawyer? I sat on that court.
Yeah.
You want a good lawyer? You should hire me.
Yeah, this is a generalization, but I think there's some truth to it. Many members of the Supreme Court in the late 18th century, throughout the 19th century, the first 150 years roughly, they viewed serving on the Supreme Court as a duty they had towards their country. They were going to serve their country. And so they would go serve their country for 8 or 10 years as a judge on the Supreme Court. And then that was enough. Now it's time to go back and be productive, right? And run a business.
Who was the model for that? George Washington.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
George Washington didn't really want to be president the first time.
Right.
We talk about the infamous secret meeting where his friends wanted to make him king, and he went in and shamed them. I think we've even talked about that in a podcast or two, right? And then he says, "Okay, I gave you my 4 years. I'm going to go back to my farm." Nah, George, we need you one more time. One more time. And there were no term limits that could have made him president over and over and over and over and over again. And he said no. He said, "Get this away from me." What's changed? What's changed is power.
Yes.
What's changed is the ability to make money from the bench, to make money as president.
Because of the power, right?
Because of the power.
Because
of
cronyism. Because government is now involved in so many things, including so many businesses.
Right.
If you're running a business and you want to influence the regulations over your business, or you want to try to land a contract for your business, you now have an interest in making sure money gets channeled to those in government so that they treat your business well. So, one of the most lucrative things you can do today in the United States, in the progressive United States, is go into politics. I mean, look at the members of Congress who enter into politics with barely a nickel to their name, and then they're there for 30 years and they walk away as multimillionaires. Right. Well, they weren't producing. They weren't out, running a business and actually producing value. They're cronies.
Joe Biden has been in government for 47 years. He has served in government for 47 years and is worth somewhere around $10 million, as has been reported. And I don't know if it's higher than that or not, but the generally accepted number is 10 million.
Right.
The most he's ever made in office was $400,000 a year. Which that alone, the fact that we're paying a government official $400,000 salary,
agreed.
That's insane.
But the point is, he wasn't inventing the smartphone.
Right.
He wasn't inventing anything.
He
wasn't producing anything.
And he might have gotten in the way of some great things being produced.
Right. Yeah.
Right. He might have taken us a step back. Right. And I'm not putting that on Joe Biden. Right.
Right.
I'm putting that on all government officials, all progressive government officials who say we're gonna insert rules here and regulations here and zoning contracts and cronyism and all of these different things.
I want to be clear. When you say progressive politicians, that is to say almost all politicians. Yes. There are very few out there who aren't progressive to one degree or to another.
We are, after all, in year 150 of the capital E progressive era.
The era of progressivism. And so my point about the court is, it's very interesting. As government has grown, as government has gotten more involved, as the scope of government powers widened and widened and widened, more members of the Supreme Court and federal courts as well, that becomes a lifelong, they will serve until they retire from all work or till they actually die in office. They don't ever want to leave those positions because of the power and the money that comes with it now.
And I think there's probably one more aspect of this that we should touch on before we finish up, and that is the progressive identity politics of the court, right? One of the other big things that progressivism has inserted itself
it's shameful.
And worked its way into every aspect of our lives is through this idea of you can't see something the same way. I mean, we've talked about this in podcasts.
Yeah.
We've talked about it in Toolbox videos. If anybody's watching and doesn't know what we're talking about, go back, watch one of those old ones. But the fact that you had Obama saying, I think it was Sotomayor, saying, I have to put in a Latina woman.
Right.
That's progressivism getting involved.
I want to make sure we're clear here. We're not just talking about the opinions that the court hands down in its official capacity. We're talking about the very composition of the court. This is progressivism shaping. It does shape that body of thought, shapes the opinions that get handed down, but it even shapes who gets nominated for the court. We need a Latina. We need someone with this color skin. We need someone of that ethnic background. When their whole job is to settle cases according to the law, the highest one being the Constitution. Right. And if there's ever a conflict between laws and the Constitution, they're supposed to uphold the Constitution.
Right.
And the Constitution, it's not merely a document with ink on it. It's a pretty short document with ink on it.
Yes.
It's not very long. The text of the Constitution does not change depending on whether you're a Latino or no matter what color skin you have or your religious background. The text of the Constitution doesn't change based on those things.
This idea, I mean, the point of what you just said is there are progressives who believe that two people who have different skin color or different chromosomes or come from different parts of the country or anything else could read the exact same words and would completely interpret them differently based solely on that trait.
Right.
Not solely on, I read this from Hamilton and I believe when Jefferson wrote this in the Constitution based on the Federalist Papers, this is what he meant.
Right.
Right? It's the color of my skin tells me, or the chromosomes inside of me tell me that Jefferson meant this.
And let's just give a concrete example of how ridiculous this is. Many of our listeners know that the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution has been just stretched beyond recognition.
Yes.
It's a very simple thing. What the Constitution actually says is that Congress, it's a grant of power to Congress. Congress has the power to regulate, and when they said the word regulate, they meant to make regular, to regularize, to regulate commerce among the states. So number one, the thing they can regulate to make regular is commerce. Commerce means trade.
Right.
And it has to be among the states.
Right.
Between, among, cross state boundaries. And questions have come up for the court. Well, how about this old farmer out here who's just growing something? He's not going across any state lines, nor is he trading it with anybody. He's just eating his own food. Does that clause, Congress has the power to regulate commerce among the states, does that authorize him? Can we regulate that? Can Congress do that? And I turn to you and you say, well, I'm a Latino or my color, I have brown skin or black skin or something. Therefore, I think that would be okay. Right? The color of your skin or your ethnic background is irrelevant to the fact that the Constitution's very specific on what powers Congress has. And if there's not a delegation of power, then Congress doesn't have it, period. That's it. And so this idea that we need people who grew up experiencing similar things to the way certain other preferred, identity groups have experienced, it takes us farther and farther and farther away from constitutional government.
Right.
For my part, and I've written this on social media, written it recently, I just want someone who will actually uphold the Constitution. That's what I don't care what their name is, what they look like, what religious beliefs they have. I don't care. I don't care if they're a man or a woman or identify as something else. I don't care as long as they will look at what government does, and when government exercises power for which there is no constitutional grant, I want a justice who says, no,
Right.
There is no constitutional basis for that power.
And we've had a few of those.
Yeah.
More closer to 1787 than 2020. But we have had a few of them over the course of the centuries of this country that have really done a good job of that. As you were explaining the whole farmer idea, I'm thinking about what if all of us had the same color skin, the same genetic makeup? We were all identical in terms of our features, right?
Right.
You take identity politics completely out of it.
Right.
And you had two candidates and that they were being considered for this. And one was a farm, one grew up on a farm, and one grew up in the city. And the one in the city says, I need what that farmer's growing, and that farmer doesn't want to sell to me. So I want a Supreme Court justice who's going to force that farmer to sell to me, using the Interstate Commerce Clause to force that that farmer to sell to me. And the other one says, I'm a farmer, and I know sometimes we just want to eat our own crops, and I don't want the government to force me to sell something. I just want to bring it in my own kitchen and eat. How insane a conversation is that?
Yeah.
If we actually took it and looked at it in that way, it's an insane conversation to be having, and yet it's really no different than anything else.
And I mean that's exactly what Ruth Bader Ginsburg did throughout much of her career.
Sure.
And she's heralded as a champion of civil rights. They call that for the government to go and say to that farmer, we command you shall sell your crops to this person over here. We have millions of fellow citizens today, progressives, who call that civil rights, that is being a civil rights activist. And it gets us so far removed. One of the decisions she signed off on was the Raich decision, which involved the federal government, Congress, many years ago, created an elaborate drug code, criminalized all these drugs. And it raises this big question, well, where the Constitution doesn't give any power to Congress to criminalize drugs. What's the basis of this power? And their answer was the Interstate Commerce Clause. Of course. Yeah. And so this case came up, I think it was based in California, and you had someone who was growing some marijuana in their own backyard and consuming it. They weren't engaged in any commerce. They weren't selling it to anybody. And certainly it had nothing to do with other states. It didn't have anything to do with being among the states, right? It's just in this guy's backyard. And Ginsburg signed off on the opinion that upheld federal statutory criminal laws criminalizing that activity. He was arrested. He went to prison. And she said, yes, the federal government can do that under the Interstate Commerce Clause, even though his activity had zero to do with it. And at that point, right, I don't care the fact that she's a woman. I don't care what her religious background is or what her ethnicity is or how she spells her name. I don't care. She's betrayed the Constitution. I want justices who are going to uphold the Constitution. That is far more important. I think it's important for the Vino Veritas Society to recognize this. That is far, far more important than the ethnicity or gender or sex or anything else of the people who are nominated for those positions.
Well, and I think to that point, as you say, as you bring up the Vino Veritas Society, I think we need to remind people, and I think fairly highly of our members, and I think fairly highly of our guardians, and say, you probably know this, and you probably don't need this reminder, but it's always important to keep reminding people. A lot of these identity politics being played, and a lot of this progressive injection into our politics that's happening is not happening just because it makes the senators rich and it makes the president rich and it makes all these people that they want to do it. They're doing it to get reelected. They're doing it because the citizens who vote them in are demanding it. There's a reason that Joe Biden said, I have to have a woman as my vice president candidate. There's a reason, unfortunately, that Donald Trump said, I've narrowed my selection to replace RBG.
Right.
I've narrowed it down to 5 women.
Has to be a woman.
He didn't say five constitutionalists.
Right.
He said 5 women.
Right.
And if it's going to be 5 women, why is he doing it? Because he thinks that's the only way it gets through the Senate.
Right.
And it looks good on his reelection chances. That's a problem.
And let's keep pulling on the strings just for a moment. And why does that get through the Senate? Because that's very politically correct to say, well, we have to have women represented on the court. We have to have people with black skin represented on the court. We have to have people with brown skin represented on the court. And that's all kind of interesting in its own way. But you know what's not represented on the court very well? The Constitution.
Right.
The Constitution isn't being represented on the court.
And to that point, and we can maybe leave it with this. I talked to some friends, right? And I brought up at the beginning of this that I'm Jewish and this was a big deal for us and it was a big deal around the Rosh Hashanah dinner table. One of the comments from one of the people who texted me is, we don't have a Jewish representative on the court anymore. I still think back, and we've talked about this many times, that letter from Washington to the Jewish congregation, the Hebrew congregation at Rhode Island.
Yep.
That was constitutional. He was talking about this Constitution, this country, what this country stands for, is for you also. Mm-hmm. The Jewish people are better off with a constitutionalist who is going to protect their rights, their right to life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
They are better off with that person who believes that applies to everybody, no matter their religion, than they are with somebody who is going to relate to them because that person is also Jewish. And to me, there's nothing more important than upholding the foundational ideas that our revolution was fought for and our Constitution was written to protect.
So is it fair to say, Dave, when you think about a rabbi, who you want as your rabbi, you probably want a Jew as a rabbi. When you think about ideally, right? When you think about a Supreme Court justice, you want a constitutionalist as a justice first.
Yeah. I'd take my rabbi. I think he'd be a good constitutionalist.
He'd probably be much better than most lawyers or judges in the country. That's for sure.
And that's why we're doing this, right? And that's why we talk to our members, and that's why we go to these chapter meetings, and that's why we get involved in all of this. Because at the end of the day, it's not about your identity. It's about protecting the document that protects this country for what it stands for.
Yep.
Because that's good for everybody.
It's absolutely right. And that document isn't going to protect itself. The ideas don't explain themselves. They need protection. They need guardians. And that's what we do with the Vino Veritas Society. We are the guardians of the American idea.
Nos sumus custodes.
Nos sumus custodes. Till next time.
We'll see you next week.